Mafia boss defended elderly woman insulted by driver. What he did surprised everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin our story. It was a chilly Thursday morning in downtown Chicago, the kind of morning where the sun barely manages to break through the clouds. On the corner of Elm Street, a frail elderly woman stood, clutching her worn purse tightly against her chest, her back hunched with age. She had lived a simple life, working as a maid for most of her years, doing what she could to survive. Today, however, she wasn't just going about her routine. She was waiting for the bus to take her to the local grocery store, a task that seemed so mundane, yet so important to her. As she stood there, trying to steady herself in the cold, a sleek black car rolled up to the curb. The driver, a young man in his 30s, parked a little too close to her, almost as if he hadn't noticed she was standing there. The car window rolled down, and the driver leaned out, eyeing her with an expression of annoyance. "Move out of the way, you old hag," he snapped, his tone sharp and filled with disdain. The elderly woman froze. She wasn't used to this kind of treatment, especially not so openly in public. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but her voice caught in her throat. She simply stood there, trying to hold back tears, her frail body trembling slightly from the insult. As she remained still, hoping the situation would just pass, the driver leaned out of his window further and muttered, "People like you should be invisible. You don't belong here." The words stung deep into her heart. She had faced adversity before, but this moment, this public humiliation, was more than she could bear. Just as she was about to turn away, retreating into herself, a loud voice interrupted. "Hey, what's going on here?" It was a voice that demanded attention, calm yet assertive. The driver turned around, startled, as he saw a tall, well-dressed man stepping out of the shadows of the building. The man was no ordinary passerby. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable but intense. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto the driver's with an authority that made the air around them shift. This was no regular individual. The driver immediately straightened up, trying to recover from the shock of having his behavior called out. "It's nothing," the driver stammered, attempting to brush off his earlier actions. But the tall man was not interested in excuses. "I saw what happened," he said, his voice colder now. "You disrespected this woman, and for that, you'll pay." The elderly woman looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone to come to her defense, let alone someone like this man. The Mafia boss, as he was known, had been a figure of both fear and respect in the city. With a swift movement, he gestured for the driver to get out of the car. "I don't care who you think you are," the Mafia boss said, his tone unyielding. "No one treats people like that in my city. You owe her an apology, and if you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." The driver, visibly shaken, tried to protest, but the Mafia boss was already moving, his cold, unwavering gaze now fixed on him. He ordered his security to take action, swiftly ensuring the driver would never harass anyone again. The elderly woman watched in awe as the situation unfolded before her eyes. She could hardly believe what was happening. The man who had insulted her was now being humiliated in front of everyone. The Mafia boss turned to her after the driver was removed from the scene, his face softening slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice no longer cold but warm with concern. She nodded slowly, still in shock, as he handed her a small envelope with a few $100s inside. "You shouldn't have to endure such treatment," he said quietly. "People like you deserve more respect." She blinked, not fully understanding. The Mafia boss gave her a nod before walking away, leaving her standing there with a sense of dignity she hadn't felt in years. This unexpected act of kindness had not only shocked the onlookers, but it had also changed her life forever. The elderly woman, still holding the envelope in her trembling hands, watched as the Mafia boss disappeared into the distance. The scene had unfolded so quickly, so unrealistically, that she could hardly process what had just happened. One moment, she was humiliated on the street by a rude driver, and the next, A powerful man had stepped in and defended her, taking control of the situation as if it were nothing. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. She hadn't known there were people out there willing to stand up for someone like her. As she walked home that afternoon, the weight of the day's events lingered in her mind. It wasn't just the money that the Mafia boss had given her. It wasn't the public humiliation of the driver, either. It was the act of kindness that came from someone she would never have expected. Someone with power, wealth, and the capacity to do anything he wanted. Yet he chose to protect a stranger, a frail old woman whom most people would have ignored. The world was a different place after today. The next morning, as she went about her usual routine, something felt different. People looked at her with more respect. Her neighbors, who usually avoided eye contact, smiled and waved at her as she passed. At the grocery store, the cashier treated her with a newfound kindness. She knew this was all a result of the Mafia boss's intervention. Word must have spread quickly. She didn't know much about him, but she had heard the whispers. He was a man of great power, a leader of sorts, someone who ran an empire from the shadows. The Mafia boss, Dominic Valentino, was a name that commanded fear and respect in equal measure. She hadn't realized how closely their worlds had intersected, but now it felt like she had crossed into his. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it cautiously, unsure of who might be visiting her. Standing in the doorway was a man in a dark suit, his posture rigid and professional. His expression was serious, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes. "Are you Mrs. Harper?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. "Yes, I am. How can I help you?" she replied, her heart racing. "Slightly. I am one of Mr. Valentino's associates," the man said, his eyes scanning her face. "He would like to meet with you. It's regarding what happened yesterday." Mrs. Harper felt her stomach twist. What did he mean by that? She had no idea what could possibly come from this meeting, but her instincts told her that whatever it wasn't something she could turn down. "Mr. Valentino has arranged a car for you," the man continued, his voice as smooth as silk. "If you'll come with me, I'll take you to him." For a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, weighing her options. She wasn't sure what kind of business the Mafia boss had with her, but after the events of the previous day, she knew she couldn't refuse. "Okay," she said quietly, stepping back to allow the man inside. "Let me just grab my things." The man nodded and waited as she gathered her coat and purse. Mrs. Harper followed him outside, where a sleek black car was parked on the street. The driver opened the door for her, and she slipped inside. The ride was long and silent, the car cutting through the busy streets of Chicago as the city buzzed around them. Mrs. Harper couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and anxiety. What did Dominic Valentino want from her? When the car finally stopped, the man gestured for her to follow him into a tall building. They entered through the back entrance, and she was led down a long hallway to a private office. As the door opened, she saw him, Dominic Valentino. He was seated behind a large mahogany desk, his posture relaxed but commanding. His dark eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you for coming." "I'm not sure why I'm here," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what you want from me." Dominic's lips curled into a small smile. "What I want," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "is to make sure you understand that what happened yesterday was not just about that driver." Mrs. Harper frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean," Dominic continued, "that it's about respect. About making sure that people like you are never treated that way again." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I want to make sure you're taken care of. I want to make sure you're safe, and I want to make sure no one ever dares to insult you again." Mrs. Harper was stunned. "What are you saying?" she whispered, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "I'm offering you a position in my household," Dominic said, his voice softening. "A place where you will be respected, where you will never have to worry about being treated as less than you are. I want you to work for me, Mrs. Harper." She stared at him, unsure of what to say. Her life had been simple, quiet, and lonely. She never expected anything like this, but here was a man offering her an opportunity that most people could only dream of. "You don't have to answer right away," Dominic added, sensing her hesitation. "Take your time. But know this. No one will ever disrespect you again, not while you're under my protection." Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, still processing everything. As she left the office and the car drove her back home, she couldn't help but feel that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. The next morning, Mrs. Harper woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. It was early, and the sun had just begun to peek through the blinds. She stretched, feeling the warmth of her bed and the quiet of the house surrounding her. The previous day felt like a dream, one that she wasn't sure she had fully understood. It wasn't every day that a man like Dominic Valentino entered your life and offered you an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. But here she was, lying in a bed that was no longer in her modest apartment, but in a guest room of a mansion. The weight of the envelope he had given her was still in her purse, and the events from the meeting flashed through her mind. No one had ever shown her this kind of kindness, let alone someone with so much power and influence. She sat up, feeling the soft linens of the bed around her, the crisp air of the mansion, making her realize just how much her life had changed in a single afternoon. But despite the luxury surrounding her, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. What exactly had she gotten herself into? Mrs. Harper didn't have time to dwell on these thoughts for long, as there was a knock at the door. She stood, still in her robe, and opened it to find a woman standing on the other side. The woman was tall, dressed in a black suit, and her expression was professional but warm. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," she said politely. "Mr. Valentino has asked me to take you on a tour of the estate and introduce you to your duties. I'm Olivia, his personal assistant." Mrs. Harper nodded, still a bit unsure of what was happening. She wasn't used to being treated with such respect and kindness, especially by someone of Olivia's apparent status. "Thank you, Olivia," she said quietly. "I'm still not sure what's expected of me, but I'm willing to help however I can." Olivia smiled and stepped inside. "Mr. Valentino has a particular way of doing things. He believes in loyalty and respect, and he values those who show kindness. That's why you're here. You don't need to worry about a thing. We'll take care of you." Mrs. Harper followed Olivia down the hallway, still trying to wrap her mind around everything. The mansion was nothing short of magnificent. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, and the high ceilings made it feel like she had stepped into another world. She was no longer in the rundown neighborhood she was used to, but in a place of wealth and power. They arrived at the kitchen, where a tall man in a chef's uniform was busy preparing breakfast. "This is Riccardo," Olivia said, introducing the chef. "He'll be preparing your meals and making sure you're taken care of." Mrs. Harper smiled politely and nodded at Riccardo, who gave her a brief nod in return before returning to his work. "You'll find that your room is fully stocked with everything you might need, and we've made sure all your personal preferences are taken into account," Olivia continued. "The mansion is large, but you'll find it comfortable. Mr. Valentino believes in making his guests feel at home." Mrs. Harper felt a lump form in her throat as Olivia led her through the rest of the mansion. The rooms were lavish, each one more impressive than the last. She had never seen anything like it. As they walked through the hallway, they came to a large library, its shelves lined with books that reached all the way up to the ceiling. "This is one of Mr. Valentino's favorite rooms," Olivia explained. "He spends a lot of time here when he's not handling business." Mrs. Harper's eyes widened as she looked around the room. She had always loved books, but could never afford many herself. Here, there were books on every subject imaginable, and the room was so quiet, so peaceful. "Do you enjoy reading?" Olivia asked, noticing her interest. "I used to, when I had the time," Mrs. Harper replied. "But life didn't leave much room for it." Olivia gave her a knowing smile. "I understand. Life has a way of doing that. But now, you have the opportunity to take time for yourself, to enjoy the things you love." They continued walking, eventually reaching a small sitting room by the garden. "This will be your private space," Olivia said, motioning to the cozy room with its soft chairs and large windows that opened up to a beautiful garden outside. Mrs. Harper's breath caught in her throat. It was all too much. She had never imagined that someone like Dominic Valentino would care enough to offer her this kind of life. She had always thought that people like him were cold, calculating, and unfeeling, but his actions spoke louder than anything she had ever expected. She looked out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Just as she was about to speak, Olivia's voice broke through her thoughts. "I know this is all overwhelming, but remember, you're here because Mr. Valentino believes in you. You've earned this." Mrs. Harper nodded, still trying to process everything. She wasn't sure where this path would take her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance at something better. Olivia stepped back, giving her some space. I'll leave you to get settled. If you need anything, don't hesitate to let us know. As Olivia walked out, Mrs. Harper stood by the window, looking out at the garden. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Her life was about to change forever. She couldn't help but feel a sense of hope that had been absent for so many years. And just for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, kindness and respect were the things that could change her world after all. Mrs. Harper spent the next few days settling into her new life at the mansion. The initial shock of being in such a luxurious place was beginning to wear off, but the reality of her situation still felt surreal. She woke up each morning in a comfortable bed, ate breakfast in a grand dining room, and spent her afternoons exploring the mansion's gardens or reading in the library. Life, which had once been filled with worry and survival, had transformed into something calmer, more peaceful. But despite all the comforts surrounding her, a part of her couldn't shake the uncertainty of it all. She still wasn't sure why Dominic Valentino had chosen to offer her this opportunity, or what he truly expected in return. Was it all just an act of kindness, or was there something more to it? She had no answers, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life had changed, and she needed to find her place in this new world. As the days passed, Mrs. Harper found herself gradually adjusting to the routine of the mansion. She was given a modest role, helping with the upkeep of the estate and assisting the household staff when needed. She wasn't expected to do anything too strenuous, but she did her work with a sense of pride. For the first time in years, she felt valued for her efforts. One afternoon, as she was polishing the silverware in the dining room, a familiar figure entered. It was Dominic Valentino, and he was accompanied by a few of his associates. Mrs. Harper stood up straight, her heart racing slightly as he approached. He gave her a quick smile, but his expression remained serious. "How are you settling in?" he asked, his voice warm but carrying an air of authority. "I'm doing well, thank you," she replied, trying to sound confident, even though she still felt like a fish out of water. "Everything's been very overwhelming, but in a good way." Dominic nodded, his dark eyes studying her with a mix of curiosity and respect. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, before glancing over at the other men who were with him. "These are some of my closest associates," he introduced them. "We're going over some business details for the next few weeks." Mrs. Harper nodded politely, unsure of what else to say. She had never been part of the world of business or power that these men inhabited, but she could sense that Dominic wasn't just another wealthy man. He was someone who commanded attention, someone who had earned the loyalty and respect of those around him. As she returned to her task of polishing the silverware, she overheard snippets of their conversation. They were discussing various deals, investments, and some family matters that made Mrs. Harper realize just how much power Dominic truly wielded. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a king in his own right, and the people around him were loyal to him because of that power. A part of her felt a sense of awe and fear at the same time. After a few minutes, Dominic turned back to her with a small but sincere smile. "Mrs. Harper, I trust you're being taken care of here?" he asked, his tone genuinely concerned. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Mrs. Harper was taken aback by the simplicity of his words. He could have easily ignored her, treated her like a mere servant, but instead, he spoke to her as an equal, offering his help without any hint of condescension. She nodded, trying to hide the emotion that was rising within her. "I appreciate that, Mr. Valentino," she said softly. "I really do." With that, Dominic turned to leave, followed by his associates. But before he stepped out of the room, he glanced back at her one last time. "You're part of this family now, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "No one will ever disrespect you again." Mrs. Harper stood in the middle of the grand dining room, the silverware in her hands forgotten as she processed his words. Part of her still couldn't believe what was happening, but another part of her, the part that had been broken and bruised for so long, felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she truly belonged. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Harper grew closer to the staff, forming quiet friendships with the other workers who took pride in their roles. She had always felt invisible in the past, but here, in this grand mansion, she was starting to feel like a person again. She no longer had to worry about where her next meal would come from or whether she would make it through the week. Here, she had a place, a purpose, and for the first time in years, she felt safe. But as much as she was settling in, she knew there was more to Dominic's offer than met the eye. She had a feeling that her story with him was far from over. One evening, after finishing her duties, Mrs. Harper found herself sitting in the garden, the cool night air soothing her skin. She was lost in thought when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Dominic walking toward her, his silhouette barely visible against the fading light. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Of course," she replied, standing to make room for him on the bench. Dominic sat beside her, the two of them looking out at the garden in silence for a moment. "It's peaceful here," he said, his voice distant, as if he were lost in his own thoughts. "I come here sometimes when I need to think." Mrs. Harper nodded, understanding the need for solitude. "I've always loved gardens," she said quietly. "There's something about the way they grow, how they change with each season. It makes me feel like there's hope, even when things seem impossible." Dominic turned to her, his expression softer than she had seen it before. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "There is always hope. No matter what happens, you have to believe that." Mrs. Harper felt her heart swell with emotion at his words. She had spent so many years fighting just to survive, but now, for the first time, she felt like she could truly live. Dominic smiled at her, his dark eyes warm with a hint of something more. "I'm glad you're here, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "You're more than just a guest in this house. You're part of the family." Mrs. Harper smiled back, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. She had never felt so seen, so valued, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Harper found herself more comfortable in her new life with each passing day. The mansion, which had once seemed so intimidating, now felt like a home. She woke up to the soft chirping of birds in the garden, had a leisurely breakfast, and spent her afternoons either reading, taking walks through the estate, or helping with small tasks around the house. It was a life of peace she had never known, and it felt like a dream that she didn't want to wake up from. But despite the comfort of her new surroundings, there was a part of her that still felt uneasy, like she was living in someone else's world. Dominic Valentino had offered her more than she had ever imagined, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her. That evening, as she sat in the quiet sitting room by the fire, lost in her thoughts, a knock at the door interrupted her peace. She stood and opened it to find Dominic standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. He had been coming to check on her more often lately, and although their conversations had always been pleasant, she couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. "Good evening, Mrs. Harper," he said, his tone calm, yet there was something different in his eyes. "May I come in?" Mrs. Harper nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. He had been nothing but kind to her since the day they had met, but she could feel the weight of his presence. He wasn't just the wealthy man who had changed her life. He was a man of power, someone who controlled his world with a firm hand, and that power seemed to hang in the air whenever he was near. "Of course, Mr. Valentino," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. "Please have a seat." Dominic moved to the chair across from her and sat down, his posture straight and commanding. For a moment, they sat in silence, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. Then, Dominic spoke, his voice softer than usual. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Something important." Mrs. Harper's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Dominic leaned forward slightly, his gaze never wavering. "I know I've given you a lot, and I want to make sure you understand the full extent of what I'm offering you," he began, his tone serious. "You're here because I believe in you, Mrs. Harper. I've seen something in you that not many people have. But there's more to this than just providing you with a place to live and food to eat. I need someone I can trust, someone who understands loyalty and discretion." Mrs. Harper felt a lump form in her throat. She had known that Dominic was a man of influence, but hearing him speak so openly about trust and loyalty made her realize just how deeply her life had intertwined with his. "What exactly are you asking me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's eyes softened, though the intensity of his presence remained. "I'm offering you a position with me," he said. I want you to be part of my inner circle. I need someone who can handle delicate matters, someone who understands what it means to protect the people you care about. I'm not asking for your loyalty right away, but I want you to know that if you choose to accept, you will have a place by my side, always." Mrs. Harper sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The words he spoke were heavy with meaning, and she could feel the weight of his offer pressing down on her. She had never been involved in anything like this before, and the thought of being so close to a man like Dominic both scared and intrigued her. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I've never done anything like that. I'm just a woman who spent her life working for others." Dominic gave her a small, understanding smile. "You're more than that, Mrs. Harper," he said gently. "You've already proven yourself by accepting what I've offered you. Trust doesn't come easily, but I see something in you that others might not. You have strength. You just haven't seen it yet." The sincerity in his voice made Mrs. Harper pause. She had spent so many years feeling small, invisible even, that it was hard to believe that someone like Dominic Valentino saw her as capable of anything more. But there was something in his words that made her want to believe him. "You'll have everything you need to succeed," he continued, his tone reassuring. "I'll make sure of that. All I'm asking for is your commitment. We can go at your pace. But know this, if you choose to take this step, you won't have to worry about anything else. I will take care of you." Mrs. Harper's mind raced, the weight of his words settling deep within her. She had spent most of her life trying to survive, trying to get by. And now, here was Dominic Valentino, offering her a chance to not just survive, but to thrive. The decision seemed too big to make in the moment, but she knew that this was a turning point in her life. I need some time to think about it," she said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. Dominic nodded, understanding the hesitation. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But know that this opportunity is real, and it's yours if you want it." With that, he stood up, his presence still commanding even as he made his way to the door. "I'll leave you to think," he said, pausing just before stepping out. "But whatever you decide, know that you're not alone. I'm here, and I always will be." As the door closed behind him, Mrs. Harper sat in the quiet room, the weight of his offer still pressing on her chest. She had always dreamed of a better life, but now that it was within her reach, she wasn't sure if she was ready to grasp it. But one thing was clear, her life was no longer just a series of struggles. It was an opportunity for something more, something she had never thought possible. The decision was hers to make, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the power to choose. The following days felt like a blur for Mrs. Harper. She had never been one to rush decisions, but Dominic's offer weighed heavily on her mind. She had spent her entire life working for others, keeping her head down, staying invisible in a world that didn't have much use for her. But now, with everything on the line, she had a chance to step into a life of power, protection, and respect. The opportunity seemed too good to be true, and the more she thought about it, the more conflicted she became. The comfort of her current life at the mansion made the decision even harder. Every morning, she woke up to a beautiful room, filled with warmth and luxury. She had everything she could ever need: safe housing, abundant food, even the respect of the staff who now regarded her with kindness. Yet, despite this newfound peace, something in her heart told her that accepting Dominic's offer would change everything. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of life. She had always been content with small, simple things, but now, here was a world of power and intrigue opening up before her. Mrs. Harper spent hours walking through the gardens, contemplating her next move. It was a perfect autumn day, the golden leaves swirling gently in the wind, the sun casting a soft, golden glow over the estate. She found herself sitting on the same bench where Dominic had joined her weeks ago. It was peaceful here, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of calm. As the soft breeze ruffled her hair, she closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind. But her thoughts kept drifting back to him, Dominic Valentino, the man who had changed her life with a single gesture, the man who had offered her more than anyone else ever had. She had always believed that people like him were beyond her reach, that they lived in a world too far removed from her own. Yet here she was, at his mercy, presented with a life she had never dreamed of. Was she ready to step into it? She thought about the people she had met in her life, the ones who had seen her as nothing more than a maid, someone to be dismissed. They never looked her in the eye or treated her as an equal. But Dominic had done the opposite. He had seen her. He had valued her, offered her a place in his world, a world that seemed so foreign to her. "You're part of this family now," he had said. The words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe them. She wasn't just someone who worked for others anymore. She was a part of something bigger, something meaningful. And that realization made her heart swell with a mix of hope and fear. Just then, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Dominic walking toward her, a faint smile on his lips. There was a confidence in his stride, a presence that seemed to fill the space around him. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice warm, but there was something serious in his eyes. Mrs. Harper stood, offering him a seat beside her. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Dominic sat down beside her, his gaze settling on the garden before them. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the peaceful surroundings offering a quiet respite from the weight of their conversation. "Have you thought about my offer?" Dominic asked, his voice soft but direct. Mrs. Harper turned to face him, her heart beating faster as she gathered her thoughts. "I've been thinking about it a lot," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just don't know if I'm ready to leave everything behind. I've spent so many years in the shadows, and now you're offering me a chance to step into the light. I don't know if I can handle that." Dominic's expression softened, his eyes full of understanding. "I understand your hesitation," he said quietly. "But you've already stepped into the light, Mrs. Harper. You're here, in my world, and you're not just a bystander anymore. You've earned your place." His words were gentle, but they carried a weight that made her heart race. "I know you're afraid," he continued, "but I can assure you that whatever path you choose, you will never have to face it alone. You have me by your side, and I'll make sure no one ever treats you the way that driver did." Mrs. Harper felt her throat tighten. The words he spoke resonated deep within her, a promise of safety, of respect, of something more than she had ever known. She had always been afraid of stepping out of her comfort zone, afraid of what might happen if she allowed herself to be seen, to be valued. But now, for the first time, she felt the weight of her decision lifting. Maybe it was time to let go of the fear, to embrace the opportunity that had been handed to her. She turned to Dominic, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she found was warmth and genuine care. "I think I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll accept your offer. I'll do it." Dominic smiled, a slow, reassuring smile that made her heart flutter. "You won't regret it," he said, his voice full of quiet confidence. "This is just the beginning, Mrs. Harper. You've already proven yourself to be someone I can trust. Together, we'll make sure that your future is secure, that you'll never have to worry about anything again." As the words sank in, Mrs. Harper felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she didn't feel alone. She had someone who believed in her, someone who saw her for what she truly was, not just a maid, but a person capable of great things. She had a place in this world now, and nothing would take that away from her. Weeks passed, and Mrs. Harper slowly adapted to her new role within Dominic Valentino's world. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was someone trusted by Dominic, a part of the intricate web of loyalty and respect that he had built around him. Her daily responsibilities had shifted as she began to handle more sensitive matters. She accompanied Dominic to meetings with his associates, helped oversee some of the estate's operations, and even became a sounding board for his business decisions. The trust he had in her was something she had never experienced before. It was both empowering and overwhelming, but she embraced the challenge. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, as Mrs. Harper was making her way to the garden to take a break, she encountered someone unexpected. It was one of Dominic's closest associates, the man who had first brought her to the mansion. His name was Marco, and unlike the other men in the household, he had a quiet, almost enigmatic presence. He was often the one who oversaw the security and logistics of the estate, ensuring everything was running smoothly behind the scenes. "Mrs. Harper," Marco greeted her with a nod, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Valentino has asked for you." Mrs. Harper was taken aback. She had grown accustomed to meeting with Dominic, but this felt different. "What's the matter?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, He motioned for her to follow him. "He'll explain," Marco said, his tone steady, yet there was an air of tension in his demeanor. As they walked through the grand halls of the mansion, Mrs. Harper couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change she couldn't quite place. When they reached the study, Marco stopped and turned to her. "Wait here," he instructed before knocking on the door. Dominic's voice called out from inside. "Enter." Marco opened the door, stepping inside with Mrs. Harper following close behind. The room was dimly lit, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk at the center. Dominic sat behind the desk, his eyes focused on a set of papers in front of him. He looked up when they entered, and his gaze softened as it landed on Mrs. Harper. "Come in, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice calm, but there was a noticeable intensity in his eyes. As she stepped forward, she could see that something was different about today. The air felt charged with anticipation. "What's going on, Dominic?" she asked, her voice tentative. Dominic motioned for her to sit across from him. "I need to talk to you about something important," he began, his tone serious. "There's a situation that requires your discretion. Something delicate." Mrs. Harper's heart began to race. She had never been involved in anything too serious, and the weight of his words made her feel the gravity of the situation. "What kind of situation?" she asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. "There's someone who has been causing trouble," Dominic explained. "A person from my past, someone who knows too much. They've been trying to undermine my operations, and they've found a way to get to me. They've been using people close to me to get information." Mrs. Harper listened closely, trying to piece together the story in her mind. "And you want me to help with this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic met her eyes, his expression hardening. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "I trust you, Mrs. Harper. I need someone who isn't involved in my world of business to help me get to the bottom of this. You'll be working directly with me to uncover who is behind this and to stop them before it gets out of hand." The request hit her like a wave. She had never imagined being involved in something like this. She had spent most of her life trying to avoid conflict, staying in the background, but now Dominic was asking for her help in something dangerous. "I'm not sure I'm cut out for this," she said honestly. "I don't have the experience or knowledge to handle something like this." Dominic leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You don't need to be experienced," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "What you have is the ability to see things clearly. You have a perspective that others don't, and that's what I need. I trust you, Mrs. Harper." Mrs. Harper sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had always been just a maid, a quiet observer of the world around her. She had never been thrust into the center of anything important. But now, Dominic Valentino was giving her a chance to prove herself, to show that she could be more than what she had always been. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Mrs. Harper realized that this moment, this decision, would change everything. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steady now, a newfound determination in her heart. Dominic gave her a small smile, his gaze warm. "You'll be working closely with Marco. He'll be your point of contact. Together, you'll gather information and figure out who is behind this and why they're trying to bring me down. We'll handle everything else." Marco, who had been standing silently by the door, nodded. "I'll make sure you have everything you need," he said. Mrs. Harper looked between Dominic and Marco, feeling the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. But there was something in Dominic's eyes, something that told her she was more than capable of handling this. She had a role to play in this world now, and it was one that she would embrace. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "I'll help you." Dominic's smile widened, a look of pride in his eyes. "I knew I could count on you," he said. As Mrs. Harper left the study, her heart was racing with a mix of excitement and fear. She didn't know what she had just agreed to, but she knew one thing. She was no longer just a bystander in her own life. She was part of something bigger, something that would challenge her in ways she never thought possible. And she was ready to face it head-on. The days that followed Mrs. Harper's decision were filled with a whirlwind of activity. She had agreed to work with Marco, Dominic's trusted associate, to uncover the identity of the person attempting to undermine Dominic's empire. Though it was a daunting task, she felt a strange sense of purpose that had eluded her for most of her life. The power that Dominic had shown her, and the trust he had placed in her, made her realize that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Marco was an enigma. He didn't speak much, But when he did, his words carried weight. He led Mrs. Harper through the first steps of their investigation, showing her how to gather information without attracting attention. He taught her the importance of subtlety, of blending into the background while still being observant enough to see the things others missed. The key to all of this, Marco explained one evening as they sat in his office, is to know who to trust. People talk, and they often reveal more than they mean to. You just need to listen. Mrs. Harper absorbed his lessons quickly, eager to prove that she could be more than just a passive participant in Dominic's world. Over the next few days, they began to piece together the fragments of information they had gathered. There were whispers of someone close to Dominic, someone who had access to sensitive information and was leaking it to his competitors. Mrs. Harper's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Who could it be? The thought of someone betraying Dominic filled her with a sense of betrayal of her own. How could anyone so close to him do such a thing? Marco didn't give her the answers immediately. Instead, he guided her through a series of careful observations, teaching her how to read between the lines of conversations and pick up on the smallest details that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. It wasn't long before they narrowed down the list of suspects to a few key individuals. One name kept cropping up, someone who had been a fixture in Dominic's organization for years. His loyalty was unquestioned, but something about the way he interacted with others made Mrs. Harper feel uneasy. His name was Elias, and his position in the company gave him direct access to Dominic's most confidential dealings. He was a man of few words, but his cold demeanor and the way he kept to himself raised red flags in Mrs. Harper's mind. As they continued their investigation, Mrs. Harper began to notice subtle signs that Elias was hiding something. He would often disappear for hours at a time, and whenever he was asked about his whereabouts, his answers were vague. Marco had his suspicions, but he wanted to be sure before making any accusations. Elias is too careful to let anything slip, Marco said one evening as they discussed their findings. But we need to be patient. If he's the one behind this, he'll make a mistake. Mrs. Harper agreed, but the tension in the air was palpable. The stakes were high. If Elias was indeed the one betraying Dominic, they needed to act quickly before he could do any more damage. They decided to take a risk. Marco arranged for a meeting with Elias, pretending to have a business proposition for him. Mrs. Harper was to accompany him as a neutral observer, keeping a close eye on Elias's behavior. The meeting was set for the following afternoon in one of the estate's private rooms. Mrs. Harper had never been more nervous in her life. As she stood by Marco's side, waiting for Elias to arrive, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about loyalty, trust, and the very foundation of the world she had entered. When Elias finally entered the room, he greeted them with his usual cold professionalism. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Marco smiled, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Just a business proposal. I thought it might be worth discussing." As they sat down, Mrs. Harper watched Elias closely. His eyes were sharp, but there was something in his posture, something guarded, that made her feel like he was hiding something. The conversation went as planned, with Marco keeping it light and nonchalant, but Mrs. Harper couldn't shake the feeling that Elias was watching her too closely. Every time she glanced at him, his eyes would flicker toward her before quickly moving away. It was subtle, but it made her stomach turn. She tried to remain calm, focusing on the conversation at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to the possibility that Elias was the one behind everything. As the meeting came to a close, Marco stood up and extended his hand to Elias. "Let's keep in touch," he said, his voice smooth. Elias shook his hand, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he replied before turning to leave. But as he walked out the door, Mrs. Harper caught a glimpse of something, a slip of paper barely visible in his hand. Her heart skipped a beat. It was too small to read, but it was enough to make her suspicious. Marco watched Elias leave, then turned to Mrs. Harper. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," she replied, her heart racing. "I think he's hiding something." They waited until Elias was out of sight before Marco quickly followed him from a distance, keeping to the shadows. Mrs. Harper stood still, her thoughts racing. She had seen enough to know that they were getting closer to the truth. But what was the next step? Would they confront Elias directly, or was there another way to expose him without tipping him off? Marco returned a few moments later, a look of grim determination on his face. He's been in contact with someone outside of the organization, Marco said quietly. Someone who shouldn't have access to this information. We've got him. Mrs. Harper felt a surge of relief, but the work wasn't over yet. They still needed to gather enough evidence to bring him down. Let's finish this, she said, her voice steady with resolve. The next few days were filled with careful observation and meticulous planning. They followed Elias's every move, collecting enough evidence to confirm that he was the traitor. When they finally had what they needed, they took it to Dominic. The confrontation was inevitable, but it was a necessary step to ensure that the betrayal was stopped before it could cause any more harm. Dominic was silent as he listened to the evidence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. I'll handle this, he said, his voice cold with authority. Mrs. Harper felt a chill run down her spine. She had helped uncover the truth, but now she was about to witness the consequences of betrayal in the world of power and loyalty. Elias's fate was sealed, and there would be no turning back. The night was thick with tension as Mrs. Harper stood alongside Dominic in his private study, waiting for the final confrontation with Elias. The evidence was clear. Elias had been leaking sensitive information to Dominic's competitors, betraying the trust that had been placed in him for years. Mrs. Harper had helped uncover the truth, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. Dominic, as always, remained calm, his expression unreadable, but Mrs. Harper could sense the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Elias had been one of his closest associates, and betrayal from someone like him was a bitter pill to swallow. The door opened with a soft creak, and Elias walked in, his usual confident demeanor now replaced with an air of uncertainty. He had been summoned by Dominic, and he knew that his fate was hanging by a thread. The two men locked eyes as Elias stood in front of Dominic's desk, his posture stiff. You wanted to see me, Mr. Valentino? Elias asked, his voice steady, but there was a nervous edge to it. Dominic didn't respond right away. He simply gestured for Elias to sit, his eyes never leaving him. Mrs. Harper remained standing off to the side, watching intently. We have a problem, Elias. Dominic finally spoke, his voice as cold and controlled as ever. A problem that you've caused. Elias's face didn't change, but his eyes flickered for just a moment, an imperceptible sign of guilt. I don't know what you're talking about, Elias replied, his voice too casual, as though he could still talk his way out of it. Dominic leaned forward, his fingers steepled together. I think you do, he said, his voice now like steel. We've been monitoring your activities, and the truth has come to light. Elias froze for a moment, his breath catching. What truth? He asked, trying to maintain his composure. But his voice betrayed him, and Mrs. Harper could hear the slight tremor in his words. Dominic didn't waste time. He reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out the documents that had been gathered over the last few days. Conversations, transactions, and notes that connected Elias to the leaks. He slid them across the table, and Elias's eyes widened as he saw the proof laid bare before him. I had hoped that you would remain loyal, Dominic continued, his tone unwavering. But it seems I was wrong. Elias didn't move for a moment, his eyes flickering back and forth between the documents and Dominic's piercing gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization of what he had done, and what it had cost him, hit him hard. It's not what you think, Elias stammered, finally finding his voice. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just... Stop, Dominic interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. You had every opportunity to stop, and yet you chose to continue. You chose to betray me. Mrs. Harper watched the scene unfold before her, the finality of the situation sinking in. She had known from the beginning that loyalty was everything in Dominic's world, and Elias had broken that rule. She had helped uncover the truth, but now she had to witness the consequences. Elias, realizing there was no way out, slumped in his chair. I was just trying to survive, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have a choice. Dominic's eyes narrowed, his gaze intense. You always have a choice, he said quietly. You chose greed. You chose to deceive me, to put this family at risk. Elias sat there, his head hanging low. There was no denying the truth now. He had betrayed the man who had trusted him, and he knew that the consequences would be severe. Dominic stood up, his presence commanding, as he looked down at Elias. You're no longer welcome here, he said, his voice firm. Leave now, and never return. Elias didn't argue. He stood slowly, his face pale, and turned to leave the room. But just as he reached the door, Dominic spoke again, his voice quiet but filled with authority. "And remember," he said, his eyes cold, "you never betray me and get away with it." The door closed behind Elias with a soft thud, and the silence that followed was thick with tension. Mrs. Harper stood motionless, her heart racing as the weight of the moment settled in. She had seen the consequences of betrayal in this world, and it was clear that Dominic's rules were not to be broken. The trust he placed in people was absolute, and once it was broken, there was no forgiveness. Dominic turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've helped me more than you know." Mrs. Harper nodded, though she could still feel the tension in the room. "I just did what needed to be done," she replied quietly. Dominic smiled, a small, approving smile. "You've proven yourself," he said. "And for that, you will always have my trust." She felt a rush of emotion at his words. She had come so far from the frightened woman who had first stepped into this world. She had helped expose a betrayal, and now she was a part of something much larger than herself. As the days went by, life in the mansion returned to its usual rhythm, but the shadow of Elias's betrayal lingered. The trust between Dominic and his associates had been shaken, and it would take time to rebuild. But Mrs. Harper knew one thing for sure: she had made the right choice. She had chosen loyalty, and in return, she had found a place where she truly belonged. Weeks had passed since Elias's betrayal, and life at the mansion had returned to a sense of normalcy. The tensions that once hung in the air seemed to have dissipated, but Mrs. Harper could still feel the remnants of that moment lingering in the back of her mind. She had seen the consequences of betrayal firsthand, and it had made her realize just how much trust and loyalty meant in Dominic's world. The calmness that had returned to the estate, however, was a quiet one, with an undertone of vigilance. Dominic continued his daily business, and Mrs. Harper found herself stepping further into her role within the household. She had proven herself to be a trusted ally, and her tasks became more varied. She helped manage the staff, coordinated events, and even began assisting Dominic with some of his personal affairs. She had come a long way from the timid woman who had once scrubbed floors for a living. Her life was no longer about survival. It was about purpose and belonging. One evening, as Mrs. Harper was walking through the grand hall, she noticed a group of people gathered in the living room, speaking in hushed tones. She recognized some of them as Dominic's closest associates, men and women she had come to know well over the past few weeks. As she approached, the conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to her. For a moment, she felt the familiar sensation of being out of place, but then she remembered her role here. She was not the maid anymore. She was part of this world. "Mrs. Harper," one of the women said with a smile, breaking the silence. "We were just discussing some upcoming events, but I think you might have some insight." Mrs. Harper stepped forward, her nerves settling as she smiled back. "What kind of events?" she asked, curious. "Well," the woman continued, "there's a charity gala coming up. It's a big deal for the company, and we need to make sure everything is perfect. We're thinking of a formal dinner and auction, but there's a lot to coordinate. I know Dominic trusts your judgment, and we thought you might have some ideas." Mrs. Harper felt a small thrill at being included in such an important event. This was a far cry from her days of being dismissed as unimportant, as invisible. "I'd love to help," she said, feeling a sense of purpose stirring within her. "Let's start by talking about the details." As the conversation unfolded, Mrs. Harper found herself contributing ideas for the gala, drawing from her own experiences. She suggested a guest list, arranged the seating plan, and even offered suggestions for the auction items. It was exhilarating to feel like her input mattered, like she had a voice in shaping something important. As the evening progressed, she found herself sitting at the table with Dominic and his associates, reviewing the plans for the event. They all respected her opinion, and it was clear that she had earned her place among them. Dominic watched her with a quiet satisfaction, occasionally nodding in agreement with her ideas. After the meeting, as the last of the guests left, Dominic walked over to Mrs. Harper, his expression thoughtful. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice warm but measured. "You've come a long way." Mrs. Harper smiled, feeling a sense of pride she had never known before. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." Dominic's smile softened, and for a moment, his eyes held something deeper, something that went beyond business. "You're more than just someone doing a job," he said quietly. "You're a part of this family now." The words felt heavy, full of meaning. Mrs. Harper hadn't realized just how much she had come to depend on Dominic's words, on his approval. But there was something about the way he said it that made her feel like she truly belonged. The next few days were spent preparing for the gala. Mrs. Harper was involved in every aspect of the planning, from the decorations to the guest list. She worked closely with the staff, ensuring that every detail was accounted for and that everything ran smoothly. It was a hectic time, but it was also the most alive she had felt in years. As the night of the event approached, Mrs. Harper couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with nervousness. This was a big moment, not just for Dominic, but for her as well. She had never imagined she would be part of something so grand, so important. The night of the gala arrived, and the mansion was transformed into a glittering display of elegance. The guests arrived in waves, each more sophisticated than the last, and Mrs. Harper found herself caught in the whirlpool of high society. But even in the midst of all the luxury and wealth, she remained calm and composed. This was her world now, and she had a place in it. As the night went on, Mrs. Harper couldn't help but notice how Dominic moved through the room, his presence commanding attention from everyone he met. People gravitated toward him, seeking his approval, his attention. But when his eyes met hers, there was something different in his gaze, something that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Towards the end of the evening, as the auction began, Dominic asked Mrs. Harper to stand by his side. She had helped organize the event, and he wanted her there when the final bids were placed. As the auctioneer called out the final lot, Mrs. Harper felt a surge of pride. She had been part of something that was bigger than herself, something that mattered. And as the final gavel fell, marking the end of the night, Dominic turned to her with a rare smile. "You did well," he said. "You've earned your place here, Mrs. Harper." The words hit her harder than she expected, and she realized in that moment just how far she had come. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was someone who had earned respect, who had found a place in a world she never thought she would be a part of. And with that realization, Mrs. Harper knew that her life was no longer defined by the past. It was defined by the choices she had made and the future that was waiting for her. The weeks following the gala felt like a turning point for Mrs. Harper. She had been officially accepted into Dominic's world, not just as someone who worked for him, but as someone who belonged. The respect she had earned from the people around her was palpable. She no longer felt like an outsider, and for the first time in her life, she was able to walk through the halls of the mansion without feeling like she didn't deserve to be there. But even as she basked in her newfound sense of belonging, she knew that things were far from simple. The world she had stepped into was filled with shadows, with things that were better left unspoken. She had seen it in the way people looked at Dominic, in the way they spoke about him when they thought he wasn't listening. They feared him, respected him, but also admired him, in their own way. It was a complicated web, and Mrs. Harper was still trying to navigate her place within it. One afternoon, as she was walking through the garden, lost in thought, she saw Dominic standing near the fountain, staring out at the water. He didn't seem to notice her at first, but when she approached, he turned and gave her a small smile. "Mrs. Harper." He greeted her warmly, though there was an unreadable look in his eyes. "How are you today?" She smiled back, though she could sense that there was something on his mind. "I'm doing well," she said. "But you seem like you've got something weighing on you. Is everything all right?" Dominic's smile faded slightly, and he motioned for her to come closer. "I'm afraid I have a situation to deal with," he said, his voice low. "Something that's been brewing for a while now, and I need someone I can trust to help me handle it." Mrs. Harper's curiosity piqued. "What is it?" she asked. Dominic looked around, as if making sure they were alone, before lowering his voice even further. "There's a person in my inner circle who has been taking advantage of the trust I've placed in them. They've been using their position to further their own interests, and it's starting to affect my operations." Mrs. Harper frowned. She had seen enough of the inner workings of Dominic's world to know that loyalty was paramount. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice steady. Dominic hesitated, clearly conflicted about whether to reveal the name. But after a moment, he spoke. "It's Gabriel Castellano," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Mrs. Harper's eyes widened. Gabriel Castellano was Dominic's younger brother, a man who had always been seen as a trusted confidant, someone who had been with Dominic since the beginning. The fact that his name was being mentioned in such a context was a shock. "Gabriel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? He's been taking advantage of your trust." Dominic let out a sigh, his frustration evident. Gabriel has always been ambitious, always wanting more. But recently, I've noticed that he's been making deals behind my back, making moves that undermine my authority. He thinks I haven't noticed, but I have. And it's getting to the point where I can't ignore it anymore. Mrs. Harper absorbed his words, her mind racing. Gabriel was the last person she would have expected to betray Dominic. But now, as she thought about it, she realized that ambition often led people down dangerous paths. "So, what do you need from me?" she asked. Dominic turned to her, his gaze intense. "I need someone I can trust to find out what Gabriel is doing, to uncover the full extent of his actions. I want you to help me gather information on him, discreetly. I can't afford for this to become public knowledge just yet." Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, processing the enormity of the task ahead. "You want me to investigate your brother," she said, her voice steady. "I understand." Dominic gave her a small, appreciative smile. "I knew I could count on you," he said. "But be careful. Gabriel is smart. He'll know if someone's watching him. You'll need to be subtle, discreet, and make sure that nothing tips him off." As Mrs. Harper left Dominic's side that afternoon, her mind was filled with a mix of emotions. She had been asked to investigate the very person who had always been seen as loyal to Dominic, someone who was family. It was a delicate situation, and the risks were high. But Dominic had trusted her with this task, and she would do everything she could to uncover the truth. Over the next few days, Mrs. Harper carefully observed Gabriel, watching his every move. She was careful not to draw attention to herself, blending in with the staff, while keeping a close eye on him. She noticed that Gabriel had started meeting with several unknown individuals, men she had never seen before. The meetings were always discreet, held in private rooms or away from the prying eyes of the household staff. There was something about the way Gabriel spoke to these men, something that made her feel uneasy. She didn't have enough evidence yet, but she could sense that something was off. As the days turned into weeks, Mrs. Harper's observations grew more detailed. She began following Gabriel at a distance, watching him leave the estate and meeting with his contacts. She noticed that he was always careful to avoid being seen, always looking over his shoulder as if he were trying to hide something. Mrs. Harper was starting to piece together the puzzle, but she still didn't have enough to confront him. It wasn't until one evening, when she followed him to a quiet restaurant in the city, that she saw something that confirmed her suspicions. Gabriel was meeting with one of Dominic's rivals, someone who had been trying to undermine his business for months. The two of them spoke in hushed tones, and Mrs. Harper could see that the meeting was more than just a casual conversation. It was a deal being struck, one that was likely to hurt Dominic in the long run. She knew it was time to take the next step, but she also knew that revealing Gabriel's betrayal would tear apart the family. As she made her way back to the mansion that evening, Mrs. Harper felt a knot form in her stomach. The truth was out there, but the consequences of revealing it were far greater than she had ever imagined. Mrs. Harper's mind was racing as she walked back to the mansion that evening, the weight of what she had discovered pressing down on her shoulders. She had seen Gabriel, Dominic's own brother, meeting with one of Dominic's rivals in that dimly lit restaurant. The conversation they had shared was more than just a casual meeting. It was a deal being made, a deal that could destroy everything Dominic had worked for. She had gathered enough evidence, but now the question was what to do with it. Confronting Gabriel directly seemed impossible. He had always been so close to Dominic, so trusted by him. Exposing him would be a betrayal of family, and Mrs. Harper knew that the consequences of doing so would tear apart not only Dominic's empire, but the very foundation of the trust they had built. But she couldn't turn away from the truth. Dominic deserved to know what was happening, even if it meant losing someone close to him. As she arrived at the mansion, the familiar sight of the estate did little to calm her nerves. She had never been in a situation like this before, and she knew that whatever happened next would change everything. She had a decision to make, and she couldn't afford to make the wrong one. Mrs. Harper walked quietly through the halls, the echoes of her footsteps ringing in her ears. She headed straight for Dominic's study, knowing that it was the only place where they could speak privately. When she reached the door, She hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before knocking softly. "Come in," came Dominic's voice from inside. She opened the door and stepped inside, closing it gently behind her. Dominic was seated at his desk, his eyes focused on a set of papers in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening when he saw her. "Mrs. Harper," he greeted her warmly. "What's on your mind?" Mrs. Harper stood there for a moment, trying to find the right words. She had always been a woman of few words, but this was different. The gravity of what she had to tell him made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Dominic motioned for her to sit, his expression attentive. "What is it? You seem troubled." Mrs. Harper took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before she spoke. "I've been observing something," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Something involving Gabriel." Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I've seen him meeting with one of your rivals," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They've been making deals behind your back, and I believe he's been working against you." Dominic's face remained unreadable as Mrs. Harper spoke, but she could see the muscles in his jaw tense as the weight of her words sank in. "I didn't want to believe it at first," she continued, "but I've followed him, and I've seen enough to know that he's been betraying you. The conversations they've been having, they're not about business, they're about undermining everything you've built." There was a long silence as Dominic absorbed what she had said. He sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her, his mind clearly racing. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Mrs. Harper nodded. "I'm sure," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've seen it with my own eyes. He's been playing both sides." Dominic took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving her. "I've known Gabriel for years," he said quietly. "He's been by my side through everything, and I've trusted him completely. This is difficult to hear." Mrs. Harper understood the weight of his words. Trust was everything in Dominic's world, and for someone like Gabriel to betray him was unthinkable. But the evidence was clear, and she couldn't allow her loyalty to blind her to the truth. "I know this is hard," she said gently, "but you need to know what's going on. He's been jeopardizing everything, and it can't go on any longer." Dominic stood up and walked over to the window, his hands resting on the sill as he looked out over the estate. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Mrs. Harper watched him carefully, waiting for him to make his decision. Finally, Dominic spoke, his voice heavy with resolve. "I won't let this go unnoticed," he said, turning back to face her. "But I need to handle this carefully. Gabriel is my brother, and I won't make a move without being sure." Mrs. Harper nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Of course," she said softly. "I just wanted you to know the truth. Whatever you decide, I'm here to help." Dominic walked over to her, his eyes searching hers. "I trust you, Mrs. Harper," he said quietly. "You've proven yourself more than anyone else in this house, and I'll make sure this is dealt with, one way or another." His words gave her a sense of relief, knowing that Dominic was not dismissing the gravity of the situation. She had done what she could to expose the truth, and now it was up to him to decide how to proceed. As she left the study that evening, Mrs. Harper couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Whatever happened next would change the course of Dominic's world, and her place in it. She could only hope that the truth would bring the justice it deserved. The following days were filled with quiet anticipation. Mrs. Harper had done what she could to bring the truth to light. Now it was Dominic's turn to act. He had told her he would handle it, but she couldn't help but wonder how he would. Gabriel was not just another employee in the organization. He was family. A betrayal of this magnitude had to be dealt with carefully, and she knew Dominic wouldn't rush to judgment. The trust that had been broken between them was deep, but so was the bond of family. Mrs. Harper spent the next few days waiting, observing the shifts in Dominic's behavior, the subtle way he distanced himself from Gabriel. It was like a storm quietly brewing beneath the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. One evening, Dominic summoned her to his study again. This time, his tone was different. There was a weight to it that told her something had finally shifted. As she entered the room, Dominic was standing by the window, looking out over the estate. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind outside. He didn't turn to face her as she walked in, but his voice carried the calm authority that she had come to know so well. Mrs. Harper, he said, his voice low. We have a problem. She nodded, already knowing where this was heading. I'm listening, she replied. Dominic turned to face her, his eyes intense. I've confronted Gabriel, he said, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. I know what he's been doing. Mrs. Harper's heart sank. She had known the confrontation was inevitable, but hearing Dominic speak about it made the situation feel even more real. What did he say? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He denied everything at first, Dominic continued, his gaze never leaving hers. But the evidence was undeniable. He's been making deals with our rivals, siphoning off information, trying to secure a position for himself. He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. I gave him a chance to come clean, but he refused. He tried to justify his actions, but it was clear that his loyalty was no longer with me, or with the family. Mrs. Harper felt a pang of sadness for Gabriel. He had always seemed like a man of principle, a man who had stood by Dominic's side for years. But ambition had clouded his judgment, and now it had cost him everything. So what happens now? She asked, her voice steady. Dominic's eyes hardened, and his posture straightened as he prepared to give his decision. I can't allow this to go unpunished, he said, his voice cold and resolute. But I won't destroy him either. He's still family. I'll make sure he understands the consequences of his actions, but I'll give him a chance to leave, to start over somewhere else. This is his last chance. Mrs. Harper nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew Dominic's decision was the only way to maintain the integrity of his organization, but it was still a painful one. You're giving him a second chance, she said softly. Even after everything he's done. Dominic's gaze softened for a moment, and he took a deep breath. Family means something to me, Mrs. Harper, he said quietly. Even when they betray me, I don't turn my back on them completely. But trust is something that can never be regained once it's broken. There was a long silence as Mrs. Harper processed his words. She had seen the ruthless side of Dominic, the side that commanded respect and fear, but now she saw another side of him. A side that valued loyalty and family above all else, even when it hurt. I understand, she said finally. I think that's the right decision. Dominic gave a small nod, as if he appreciated her understanding. Thank you, he said. You've proven yourself more than anyone else in this house, Mrs. Harper. You've shown me that loyalty and integrity are more than just words. They're actions, and you've done everything I've asked of you without hesitation. Mrs. Harper felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had always worked hard, but she had never expected this level of recognition. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was truly seen, truly valued. I'm just doing what I believe is right, she said quietly. Dominic's smile was small but sincere. That's all anyone can do, and that's why I trust you. As the night wore on, Mrs. Harper left the study, her mind still processing everything that had happened. Dominic had made a difficult decision, one that would affect not only Gabriel's future, but the future of the entire organization. But Mrs. Harper knew it had been the right decision. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about trust, loyalty, and standing by one another, even when it seemed impossible. As the days passed, Gabriel quietly left the mansion, never to return. Dominic had given him a second chance, but it was clear that their paths would never cross in the same way again. The atmosphere at the mansion was quieter now, but there was a sense of peace in the air. Dominic had made sure that the betrayal had been dealt with, and now it was time for him to focus on what mattered most. Keeping his empire strong and protecting the people who had earned his trust. Mrs. Harper continued her work, now more integrated into the world Dominic had built. She was no longer just an observer. She was a part of something much larger. She had earned her place in this world, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she had truly found where she belonged. And as she walked through the halls of the mansion, her head held high, she realized that her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. She was no longer just a woman struggling to survive. She was someone who had earned the respect of the most powerful man she had ever known, and she would never have to go back to the shadows again. This captivating journey through power, trust, and betrayal unfolds in a world full of complex characters and high-stakes decisions, making it a must-read for fans of romance stories. As the protagonist rises from humble beginnings, the line between loyalty and ambition becomes increasingly blurred, creating an intricate backdrop for romance stories that delve into the hearts and minds of unforgettable characters. With each twist and turn, the stakes grow higher, leading to shocking revelations that will leave you breathless. As the characters navigate the challenges of love, trust, and family, the true meaning of loyalty is tested in ways that are both heartbreaking and heartwarming, all within the framework of romance stories that blend passion with intrigue. This tale takes you deep into the emotional and psychological landscapes of its characters, offering a narrative filled with suspense, drama, and of course, romance stories that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Whether you're new to the genre or a seasoned fan, this story offers a fresh take on love, loyalty, and the price of betrayal, showcasing the power of romance stories to connect deeply with readers on a personal level.